All right. What is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. I'm your host, Coach JK McLeod, and today we are going to answer the question, is macro coaching a scam? And I totally get why that question is coming up, because if your understanding of nutrition is just hit your macros and you're good, then yeah, it can start to pretty much feel that way pretty quickly. I think that the topic, as always, has much more nuance and much more context to it. And I can just let you know up front, the idea that macro coaching might be a scam didn't just come out of nowhere, but it also didn't stay where it started as far as the whole, like, if it fits your macros movement. Like somewhere along the way, something that I think was a pretty useful tool got turned into like the entire strategy. And now you've got folks that are either blindly following it or just completely writing it off as a scam. And from my perspective, neither side really has the full picture. But before getting into any more of today's episode, let me first, as always, take a moment to say thank you for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. I truly appreciate each and every listen. So let's go ahead and get into today's episode. All right, it is another Tuesday fitness adjacent, fitness focused episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. And I am starting off with a bit of context, as always, with the question, or where the question came from, is macro coaching a scam? So someone on Threads that I saw their post, and they essentially said that at the end of the day, macro coaches are people who don't care about food quality. They specifically just focus on numbers. And in the back and forth that I had with this particular individual in the comments, I totally understand why not only they, but other folks also think that and have that particular perspective. From their perspective, and this is what the individual really brought up, they see people who are selling like one-time macro prescriptions, whether it's a coach or it's a gym. There are coaches who will straight up just reduce the nutrition, the basically the formula success to nutritional success to be just basically a math problem. And at the end of the day, it still is just not the whole picture. And I want to be upfront here. This is not intended to be a defense of macros or macro coaching. I myself used to do nutrition coaching where counting macros was the primary strategy that I used within that nutrition coaching. I no longer specifically focus on nutrition coaching. So as far as it goes, I have, when I say no skin in the game, I mean like no skin in the game, because I don't advertise myself as a macro coach or anything even close to it. So I don't have, at the end of this particular episode, there's not going to be some sort of an offer or anything like that as far as macro coaching goes. So I just mentioned that to say that I have no skin in the game here. I do have close personal relationships with many nutrition coaches, more than I can actually count right now in my head. And they all use a completely wide assortment of coaching strategies, whether it is counting macros or is not counting macros or anything in between, all sorts of different experiences there. So I feel like I believe that I am in a pretty solid position to present a lot of different perspectives on this, including my own. So let's go ahead and get into it. So first, let's talk about why this particular confusion seems to exist. And again, this is from my perspective. So I'm just going to call it like it is. When it comes to nutrition coaching, these days, the barrier to entry is pretty low. And especially when it comes to someone advertising themselves as a macro coach, the barrier to entry is even lower. So anybody can plug numbers into a calculator that you can find online, whether it's something like tdee.net, whether it is going to the actual Precision Nutrition site and punching in goals and coming up with macros that way, or going into MyFitnessPal and putting in what your goals are and getting macros that way. Anybody can put those numbers in and then take those numbers and give them to you, and they can call that macro coaching. So the thing with that goes in conjunction with that is also that you have social media that really rewards simplicity. Social media, especially really engaging posts, they love to reward us as coaches when we create very simple answers to what can many times be complex problems. So something like saying eat 150 grams of protein and you're good, that's the stuff that does numbers. It's the stuff that does really well. As my friend Betsy Foster will many times say, she's been on the podcast, I think once or twice. I've been on her podcast too. And many times she will talk about the nuance. There's so much nuance to these things, and rarely does nuance do really well from an engagement standpoint. So it is what it is there. So the reality check here is that when you get a PDF with a whole bunch of numbers that tells you exactly what macros you're supposed to follow, that is not specifically coaching. When you get calculations that just came from punching your numbers in on MyFitnessPal, TDEE.net, Precision Nutrition Coaching site, whatever it might be, that's still not a specific strategy. And I will agree that if that's what you're being offered, then no, that is definitely not worth anything considered like premium pricing, because it's not coaching. So I completely agree with criticism from that particular angle, because that's a version of this industry that really deserves to be called out. So let's kind of bring it back a little bit and talk about just where this whole thing, I think, first began, and then just kind of how it got blown out of proportion. And where things from my perspective really began was in the rise of IIFYM, which is also called If It Fits Your Macros. So I believe that this all really started with If It Fits Your Macros, and then grew to then sprouting macro coaching. So in the earlier days, If It Fits Your Macros came from bodybuilding culture. So bodybuilding culture pretty much promoted strict meal plans where it was like chicken or tilapia, rice, and broccoli. It was very rigid. It was very clean eating focused. And then right around I'd say the early 2010s is where If It Fits Your Macros really started to become more popular. It was also called flexible dieting. So back in the day, if you happen to remember bodybuilding.com, on those particular forums, If It Fits Your Macros and flexible dieting started to gain more and more popularity. I would say that Lane Norton was probably one of the early adapters or early like godfathers of talking about flexible dieting. And it was this shift from, instead of you have to eat these specific foods, it was the understanding that you could potentially be more flexible with your food choices as long as you were paying attention to the quantity of the calories that you were eating within each of the macronutrient categories. Macronutrient categories being carbs, fats, and proteins. I'm going to try not to get like too much in the weeds here, but the overall big idea here is that in the early 2010s, when folks started to shift to If It Fits Your Macros, instead of more of the strict like meal plan, tilapia or rice, like that sort of a feel, the understanding was that your total intake is what matters more than being absolutely perfect with the choices that you are making. So in terms of that, I think what If It Fit Your Macros got right is, one, calorie balance totally matters. Like that does make a difference, your overall quantity of what you're consuming. Also, the fact that protein intake does matter. And that's something I for sure think we've gone like way overboard now. I mean, now we got protein soda, we got protein everything. I think we're soon going to have like protein toilet paper where when you wipe, you can also get your protein in. Weird, but just don't, just come back and let me know if you happen to see that. Anyways, I think also another thing that If It Fits Your Macros potentially got right is that having some flexibility in your overall nutrition plan can help improve your adherence. So a strict meal plan where you can only eat certain things, and again, the chicken, rice, broccoli, like that was the classic for many times. Many times folks would report back that that led them to then going off the rails. And that's when cheat meals kind of became the thing. However, if you allowed yourself more flexibility, then you found yourself more adherent to your overall plan. But where things really started to go sideways with If It Fit Your Macros is people took that flexibility and basically turned it into like a free for all, like YOLO, anything goes. So micronutrients, your fiber, and your food quality, that stuff really, it just kind of got ignored. So I am definitely I fit this camp where I jotted down like the reminder about like Pop Tarts fits your macros. That definitely became the headline. Like I mean, I probably went through about a 2 to 3 year period where I'm not sure if I ever didn't include Pop Tarts in my post workout consumption. It would be like two Pop Tarts and a protein shake. And one time, or not one time, for a while, the gym that I worked at made the mistake of showing me how to make the smoothies at the smoothie bar. So I started mixing my Pop Tarts in with my protein shake. Yeah, it was some wild times back then. So that's where we started with If It Fits Your Macros. Then the next phase got into macro coaching, and you had coaches who started using macros as a tool instead of the actual, like a rule book. So you had folks that were advertising themselves as macro coaches. However, they weren't looking at it like, okay, you have to stick to these particular things specifically because this formula is what works. Macro coaches were folks and are folks, again, from my perspective, which is different than the individual who I was talking to or messaging on threads. Macro coaches, from my perspective, are folks who utilize the macros as a tool and then help shift folks towards specific behaviors, a better overall adherence, and understanding how nutrition fits into their lifestyle. So it started off with If It Fits Your Macros being all about, okay, it's just about hit the macros. And then as macro coaches started to sprout up, there was this understanding of, okay, we can utilize this particular tool, and we're trying to break away from the rigidity. We're just utilizing this particular tool and also taking into account what people's behaviors are, helping them with their overall adherence, and then ensuring that it fits their particular lifestyles. So it was very interesting because I think that macros really started as a complete rebellion against the rigidity and the strictness of the classic bodybuilding diet. And then you just had some people that turned it into like a different type of rigidity where it was like, you have to hit your carbs, you have to hit your fats, have to hit your proteins with no sort of flexibility within that. So I want to share with you my perspective and what I really think is like the core of my message here today. And that's just this difference with macro coaching versus just macro counting. So these are where I think are the main differentiators really come into play. So macro counting itself is a tool. So macro counting is the tool. You are focused on having particular numbers. Those numbers then give you the targets that you're looking for, and then you're tracking intake. That's it. That is the tool. Macro coaching is an actual process. So you've got an actual coach, a live person who's asking, can this person follow this consistently? Do they understand what they're eating? Are they getting in enough fiber and just nutrients in general? Do they have variety to what they're eating? And then if you know me, you know my vibe. Maybe more importantly than or second, I would say, to the are they getting in the proper nutrients is, does this fit their lifestyle? Does it fit their schedule? Does it fit their stress? And does it fit their family life? So those are the pieces that make up macro coaching. So again, macro counting is the tool. Macro coaching itself is the process. So you can have two clients who have the same exact macros. And again, just to review, two clients who have the same macros means you can have two clients that have the same amount of carbs that they're eating, the same amount of fats that they're eating, and the same amount of protein that they're eating. If you have one who mostly eats whole foods, hits their fiber, and is feeling pretty good, then they likely are progressing. You can have another one, though, who is focused only on hitting the numbers, and they do it primarily with ultra processed food, things that are low in fiber, things that are low in nutrients. They might possibly experience things like energy crashes and hunger spikes. So you have same macros across both individuals. However, it's not uncommon to have very different outcomes. And that's not because the numbers failed. It was the application of those numbers themselves. And this is the part where I want to talk to you about the money conversation. And this is where I'm going to offer you a perspective that maybe you don't hear very often. If I was really, really savvy with marketing, I would say this is the secret that they don't want you to know about macro coaching. So if someone is straight up just like charging you to give you numbers one time with no additional support or resources offered with that, that is not coaching. That is a transaction. That is, it's not a service. Just flat out, that's what it is. So the part that most people don't tend to see is from a coaching perspective. A lot of times when we are offering, or I shouldn't say we, because I don't get into that anymore. From my experience, when a coach is offering a one-time macro prescription, it's also something that we call a lead magnet. So it's not always meant to be the full solution. It's meant to be an introduction into the knowledge that the individual has, and more often than not, also some sort of at least a conversation starter with you. So that one-time macro prescription is not all about just providing you with those numbers. Again, that would be just a straight up transaction. There should also be some resources and some offer of support along the way, or some sort of a follow-up at the very least. So what happens typically is you get the numbers and then you go try to implement them. And then really one of two things is going to happen. You either see some success or you run into issues pretty quickly. So let's say you have a call on April 1st, which is on a Monday, and you go start implementing. And then by the next week, you are either starting to see some progress pretty quickly, or you are crashing and burning because all you're doing is just trying to hit those numbers, and that's it. Either way, if you have a coach who's utilizing it as a lead magnet, the ones that are really good will typically have a follow-up with you, or they'll reach out, they'll check in, and they'll say, hey, how are things going? And they maybe even give you a few pointers based on what you're experiencing. If it becomes really clear that you need more guidance, that's when the conversation will typically shift towards actual coaching. That's why for many folks, it's called a lead magnet. It's something that helps with generating leads. Hey, would you like me to calculate your macros for you? You have that particular conversation. You follow up. During that follow-up, things are going well. Okay, cool. How else can I support you? Keep going. Or you have that follow-up. Hey, I'm really struggling. Okay, what are you struggling with? Is there another tip that I can potentially give you? I'd like you to implement that. I'm going to follow up with you again. Also, in the meantime, I want you to think about if this is something that maybe you'd like a little bit more personalized attention. That's something I can definitely help you with. Because at the end of the day, there's this mistake in people thinking that the value is in getting this one-time number. And that's not the case. The numbers are simply just your starting point. So the real value, if it's done well, comes from what happens after you've gotten those particular numbers. And I think that this is also where people really struggle to see the value in coaching, because they're comparing it to a one-time transaction as opposed to what really is like an ongoing process. So I really want to reframe the things that you should be paying for. You should be paying for adjustments over time. You should be paying for education. You should be paying for accountability, and you should be paying for problem solving when, as the folks say, life starts lifing. So those are really the things that if you are looking to invest, that's what you ideally should be investing in. So if you are working with someone who is prescribing you macros as a strategy, those things should still continue to be adjusted based on feedback, not just based on a formula. I actually, back in the day, worked for a company who had a very specific formula that they wanted followed when you were working with clients. And periodically, someone would come in and check my reviews. And if I didn't prescribe or make changes to a client's macros based on the formula that they had, I basically got like a little kind of a slap on the wrist, and then they overrode that client's macros, quote unquote, for me. I went back and changed it again. However, that's some of the stuff that happens behind the scenes. And if you're utilizing like an AI driven model, I myself even use an AI driven model for coaching myself through my nutrition. I've talked about it many a time before. I use Macro Factor. I'm very comfortable in utilizing that because I can also make the adjustments. Uh, and I let the app do its thing, and then I can make the adjustments from that. But when you're utilizing something like that, that is going based on a formula, and there's not really space for providing specific feedback about difficulty with adherence, stressful times that you're going through, anything like that. So that's also something that should be included if you are working with someone, whether they advertise themselves as a macro coach or not. Even if somebody's primary tool and strategy that they use with you or their clients is macros, there are still conversations about hunger, sleep, stress, libido, all those things. So also a piece of that too is that I'm a big believer that regardless of whether, even if utilizing macro tracking is the primary tool, it's not something that someone needs to be doing forever. So you're not specifically working with that particular person. If you're looking at macro coaching, you're not working with them specifically to pay for the macros. You're paying for understanding how to be empowered and knowledgeable to pay for. You're paying for the ability to understand how to be, what am I trying to say? Be empowered and knowledgeable to make better decisions over a longer period of time. Okay. So this is, let me go ahead and start to close things out here. So my internet just started freaking out. So we're going to see if, okay. All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see if this recording still goes because my internet just started freaking out. So here's where, fortunately, I'm going to start wrapping up here. So here's where I want to start wrapping things up. I do believe that macros are useful as a tool. They, however, are not like the absolute foundation for where your success lies. This is why I am such a strong proponent and very biased in starting with the 3 foundational habits: eat well, sleep enough, and exercise regularly. Macros certainly can support the eat well category, but they definitely don't define exactly what that is. So that's why the habit-based approach is something that I'm a strong believer in. So I definitely use macros when they make sense, and then other times I move away from them when they don't. I track fairly regularly. I don't track every day of my life at all. So that's what I wanted to share with you. So let's bring it back home and simple takeaway. So if you're thinking about macros, don't just ask like, what are my numbers? Ask, what is this helping me do better? So if you found this episode to be helpful in any way, shape, or form in understanding a bit more about the question, is macro coaching a scam? Then I appreciate you, and I would love to hear that feedback. If you found that this just maybe confused you even more, basically anything in between, if you have just any thoughts, definitely reach out and let me know how this episode did or didn't impact you. If you also happen to know a friend, a work colleague, or an enemy, anybody who you think might actually be interested in listening to this episode, I would sincerely appreciate it if you would pass it along. I think that with the macro coaching conversation, it's something that really, I think, hit its peak just a handful of years ago. I think that it died down, and then now it pretty much is like the punching bag for other coaches to basically talk about like, hey, macros don't matter. It's more about your hormones and different things like that. And the fitness industry really behind the scenes is just a matter of picking like, which thing do you want to bash when? And At the end of the day, my goal is to provide you with some additional perspective and, as evidenced, hopefully in this episode, maybe even pull the curtain back on how it's being approached from a coaching and more of like a marketing standpoint so that you can understand why you are receiving the messaging that you're receiving these days. All right. With that, we're going to bring today's episode to a close. Thanks for bearing with me through whatever was going on here internet-wise. Hopefully that is still working fairly well. And I appreciate it. This has been another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Take care, and I will talk to you next time. Bye now.